has an x squared in it, it doesn't have x3s, x4s, x5s. And if it's a quadratic equation, it's got that x squared piece and an equal sign. And we should be able to put all the pieces over on the left, identify your A, your B, and C, and put it into the quadratic formula, which is what?
X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2.
There we go. X equals. So that's our quadratic formula. Every quadratic equation, you should be able to identify an x squared piece, an x piece, and a number piece as A, B, and C. So to kind of review what we've already learned, I'm going to start by making a quadratic equation, and then we're going to solve it using the quadratic formula. All right, wait. I'm going to use 6. But hold on. To start, one way to make a quadratic equation and know what the solutions are is if I just said, when Tori said 6, let's say I put x plus 6 and
minus
then
12.
X minus 12. All right, so this is a quadratic equation. It doesn't have x squared in it as it looks right now, but what happens, the very first thing you do if you FOIL this out, what happens when you multiply these?
X squared.
X squared. So what this is in the factored form where we can easily identify the answers by setting this equals 0 and that equals 0. So what are the two answers to this?
What?
Okay, you have to really think.
-6 and x equals 12.
Positive 12, yeah.
Yeah.
You have to really think back. When you had these two parentheses multiplied,
Oh.
and that equals 0, you can say x equals -6, x equals positive 12. That's something from quite a while back. But the whole point I want to get is I want to know these answers. Now, if we FOIL this out and use the quadratic formula, those should be the answers that you get. So if you FOIL this out,
X squared minus 12x plus 6x minus 72.
yep. And then those go together, and it just makes x squared minus 6. All right, so this is the quadratic equation with its a, b, and c. So our a is 1, our b is -6, and our c is 72. If I put this into the quadratic equation, I start with x equals -b, but it's already negative.
So it's 6
So
plus
6.
or minus negative. What do you have? Yeah.
-6 squared minus 4,
1,
1,
negative 72.
all over 2a, so it's all over. All right, so if I put that in the calculator, I should get one of these two answers that Sam said a second. So the very first thing will be, okay, x equals 6 plus square root of -6 squared minus 4, 1, all over 2 times 1. Okay, put it in, the first thing I get is 12. Then put it in, and you put it in once with the plus sign, once with the subtraction sign, and that should get you the -6. So, up until this point, all we've seen is every quadratic equation, you can identify your A, your B, and your C, put it in the quadratic formula, and get an answer. Now the problem is, sometimes, when you have a square root, sometimes this business right there, that I kind of highlighted or circled in there, comes out negative. And if you have a negative underneath a square root, what happens?
Don't you have to do the cube or whatever?
Well, are you allowed to have negatives under square roots?
No.
No, because then what do you end up turning it into?
Positive.
An imaginary number.
I's. Remember when you had like a negative, say that you had like a -12 under there, we would end up turning it up into I, square root of 12.
Oh.
So what we say, when we work this out and we don't get an answer with the quadratic formula, you're going to see on the calculator, it's going to say domain error. What's happened is we're not getting any real solutions. And then we're going to worry, when we get to objective 120, we're going to talk about how to figure out what the imaginary ones are. So for objective 119, we're not going to try to actually solve and find out what the imaginary ones are. We're just going to figure out that there aren't any real solutions. Examples that I have for you here. All right, first one starts out with 6x squared equals -48. All right, 6x squared equals -48. I'm definitely looking at an equation. How do I know that this is a quadratic equation?
X squared.
It's got x squared. So if it's got an x squared, what I can do is try to solve it with the quadratic formula. If I want to solve with the quadratic formula, what has to happen?
48 over.
Yeah, it's got to go over. I want everything on the left. So I got 6x squared plus 48 equals 0. Okay, now I'm going to identify my A, B, and C and put it into the formula. So what's A?
6.
What's B?
48.
Okay. B is
0.
0. Remember, what there's B is supposed to be the X piece.
Oh, yeah.
So it's the one that's missing, and if it's the one that's missing, it's 0. And then C is 48.
Oh, yeah.
And then put this, A, B, and C, into the calculator. So we're going to start X equals negative B, so X equals negative 0, or just 0, either way. Plus or minus the square root of B squared, so 0 squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A, which is 2 times 6. Now normally, I've got it in right. I should be able to hit this and get some sort of answer, and then I'm going to change my plus to a minus and get the other answer, but this happens. Domain error. So what that means is what's underneath the root must be coming out to be negative. And we'll worry about that more when we get to objective 120. But for today, what you're going to say when you get this error is that I don't have any real solution. So I'm going to say I got no real solution. We'll just say this, no real. I'll just use that shortening for a little bit. No real solutions. When you got no real solutions, you actually will have two imaginary ones. Like I said, tomorrow we're going to actually figure out what they are. All right, let's look at the next one. Quadratic equation, for sure, it's already ready for A, B, and C. What's my A?
9.
9, and then B,
1.
1, and C, 1. So you got your A, B, and C identified. You should easily be able to put it into your quadratic formula. And let's hope we get an answer. Remember on 119, some of them will give you answers. They're just going to throw in some that won't, and you just need to be ready for it. If you've done it right. X equals negative 1 plus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. If done right, I'd like an answer, but if I did it right and I get this, all that means is I don't have any real solution. What's under the square root must be coming out negative and messing everything up. So this one is a no real solutions. All right, let's look at the next example. Now I'm going to work this one out a different way. I'm going to tell you, though, that you can use the quadratic formula, and if it gives you that domain error, that means there's no real solutions. I want to show you another way, which we actually did cover quite a few weeks ago, that you can do it without the quadratic formula, and I think it's just as easy. Remember, the quadratic formula will always work. But one way to easily tell this, if you have 2x squared plus 24 equals 0. Anytime you got a quadratic formula that doesn't have a b piece, doesn't have the x piece, what you can do is if you'll just move all the numbers over to the right, leave x squared right here, move the 24 over, get the coefficient off, we can solve it that way as well. So I'm going to minus the 24. And you got 2x squared equals negative 24. I'll change pens. 2x squared equals negative 24, and I'm going to divide the 2 off of the x squared. And I get x squared equals negative 12. X squared equals negative 12. Now, some of you who were in geometry last year, we did a whole bunch of that a squared, b squared equals c squared, and you'd work it down to your very last thing where you have your letter squared equals a number. Remember to unsquare your letter, what do you got to do? Square root. So what you do is you end up square rooting, and then you're supposed to put a plus minus on the right side. But what happens when you square root a negative number?
You have to hug it.
Well, when you
Or
square,
no, you have to.
if you,
Square crosses out.
yeah, what happens on the right side though? What if you have a negative under your root? It becomes I. So what you're really seeing is if you have the square root of a negative number, you don't have a real number. You end up with an I number. You get x equals plus or minus I square root of 12. And so then you're going to go on this, you're going to go, well, I don't have any real solutions. I've got imaginary ones. So if you end up trying to square root a negative number, you have no real solutions. So you would go, I got no real solutions. Well, the reason I'm showing you that is because it's kind of easier to see if you would think about it from the beginning. Say that if you went to just do it, say you were just going to look at it. Like, I'm not even going to work it out. I just want to think. If I move 24 over, it's negative. Divide by 2, it's still negative 12. And square root of negative 12, that is not real. You can't square root of negative. Now look at the next example. If you tried the same thing here, will this one be real or imaginary? First, you're going to divide by 2, and then it's going to be positive 27. And then you're going to square root of positive 27. So it will give you a real answer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide that real quick right here. I'm going to say divide by 2. And then I'm going to write x squared equals 27. And you sure can square root with a plus or minus. And then I just need to know what is the square root of 27. In my calculator, I can just say, look, that's 3 squared is 3. So I got x equals plus or minus 3 square root of 3. And you see that that is option A. Okay, so that's it just for knowing on objective 119, if you use the quadratic formula and you are getting the domain error, that means that there are no real solutions. There's going to be imaginary ones, and we're going to talk about those things tomorrow. But for today, just know when there's no real ones that we can sometimes say there is no real number solution. All right, that's it for 119.